Today we have a very special guest, Ken Cook, the visionary founder of the Environmental Working Group. Have you ever stopped to wonder about the toxins we're exposed to every single day? From the water we drink to the food we eat, it sometimes feels like there's almost nothing we can't consume that doesn't come with a health warning. Ken Cook and the Environmental Working Group have been at the forefront of uncovering these hidden dangers. In this conversation, Ken will guide us through the types of environmental toxins that we're commonly exposed to, how they impact our health, and where they're most prevalent in our everyday lives. But don't worry, it's not all doom and gloom. We'll also discuss practical solutions, what you can do to minimize your exposure. If you've ever wondered how to create a safer home environment, how diet can help reduce your body's toxin load, or even how to choose products that won't harm your health, this episode is for you. Not everybody's ready to hear this conversation, but if you are ready, get ready to go deep. It's Ken Cook. Ken, welcome to the podcast.
Andy, it's a thrill to be on. I've watched any number of yours, and I'm really honored to have a chance to visit with you today.
Ken, I remember when I was a kid, I would come home from school and we had a garden shed at the back of the house. And my dad worked in the army, didn't make much cash. And so for extra cash, he used to build bikes. He'd restore bikes and then he'd sell them. But he always sprayed every bike this same color, this kind of like a sky blue. But one of my earliest memories, it's not a sound, it's not a story, it's not a picture, it's a smell. It's a smell of being in that shed with very poor ventilation and him just spraying bike after bike with no mask on. And I remember saying to him in later years, like, was that not dangerous? And his rationale was, sure, look, I've lasted this long. It can't be that bad. And I wonder, is that a rationale when I think about this whole area of toxins, whether we talk about toxins through food, toxins through congestion, toxins through even like the water coming through our showers and taking them into our body. Is that the big domino? Is that the concern we're pushing against all the time? This sure, I've lasted this long.
Yeah, it is. And it is, in particular, it's what we're pushing through with men. I'll tell you a funny story. We did some focus groups years ago. We were trying to convey to people the very point you're bringing up. How concerned should I be about toxic chemicals in my world, especially when it's at parts per billion or maybe parts per trillion? How could that possibly make a difference? That can't have significance biologically. Obviously, with your father, if it was enough for you to notice as a child breathing it, that was very obviously an environmental insult. And so in these focus groups, when we would go to women and we would say, well, the facts we're still collecting the science and the facts. But from what it appears, these chemicals are at levels in food or air or water that are of concern. And the women's focus group would always say, well, then, okay, let's just move on to something that we know is safer. Why get stuck on this, whether or not you've got enough proof? Then we went into the men's focus group, and it was kind of like your dad said, the response would be things like, well, it's, something's going to kill you, or the dose makes the poison and that's such a low dose. That's where you think maybe somebody's got a little science background. But the moment that really told us we were in trouble with men, and poll after poll shows it's much harder to get men to notice this, just like it's harder to get men to pay attention to going to the doctor. It's not unrelated. Poll after poll would show what we found in this focus group in the Midwest. We finally said, well, there's a whole group of toxic chemicals, and there's a lot of science that's emerged that shows that they're actually causing sperm counts to be reduced in men. We have lower sperm counts now than we used to have. And the sperm that we do have oftentimes are less active, lower motility, as they say in the field. And the room went quiet, Anthony. The men looked quite shaken. And finally, one of them raised his hand and he bravely said, when we signed up for this session, they said there'd be sandwiches. It's like, Okay, well, maybe we didn't quite have them. Maybe they're still thinking something's going to kill you, or I'm still going strong. And what we point out for people like that is, hey, that's certainly true. There are people who smoke their whole lives and don't come down with lung cancer. There are people who are exposed to asbestos and don't come down with mesothelioma. There are definitely people out there who don't suffer the kinds of illnesses related to the environment. Asthma is a great example. Rising rates of asthma in the United States amongst children, but not every child. It's a scary level. I think it's like 14 or 15% of kids now in the U.S. are asthmatic, and it was much lower just years ago. What's going on? Probably indoor air pollution and outdoor air pollution. But the fact of the matter is not everyone is affected. So we're not all the same. So that's the medicine has, for decades now, been moving in the direction of paying attention to the person, not the normal distribution, not the average person, the actual person. And we just often don't know how it's going to affect someone. I hope your dad is he still with us? Is he still alive?
He's still alive, kicking, not spraying as many bikes, but he's still going good.
Yeah. So, and so that's proof that we're all different. Not that the dose makes the poison, not that it's harmless. And there are some occupations, I think of farmers in particular, but there are others, people who, working people, as we call them in the States, who, they develop a different sensibility about risk, especially men, because they've made a decision to pursue a certain occupation that requires them to be exposed in many cases. Not always the case. We've tried to improve occupational safety. I hope your dad, if he's painting bikes still, is ventilating better.
He's not doing it anymore. But actually, that's an interesting point, because you were talking about the difference between men and women in their appreciation of the dangers. There's an Irish expression, maybe it's one that's common in the US as well. It's a little bit rude, but it's giving a shit when it's not your turn to give a shit. And I wonder, when I listen to this, is it, yes, maybe there's the data on gender, but is something that's more overriding than that? Is it like socioeconomic based? Is there almost a Maslow's hierarchy of needs here, that if I don't have my basic needs covered, food, shelter, stability for my family, it's just too peripheral of a matter for me to give my attention to?
I think that's right. The phrase the word that's often used now is intersectional. Where it's not just gender, it's not just economic status. It might also be race. It might be family upbringing. All kinds of things that condition these attitudes. And we do know that from our experience, at Environmental Working Group, the organization I run, we have probably 30 plus million visitors to our website every year. And we know that over 80% of them are women, are female. And most of that website traffic is related to people trying to find out tips, guidance, ideas for avoiding toxic chemical exposure. It's not all of it. We have other properties on the website, other information available that people do consult. But, it's what's in my personal care products, what's in my food, what's in my tap water in the U.S., and it's millions, tens of millions of people every year. And what I come away with thinking is, okay, if it's that heavily tilted to women's sensibilities, style of reaching judgment, style of evaluating evidence, what do I learn from that helps me reach my team? And I think a big part of it is, I find that you can reach men like you can reach a lot of people, but men in particular, when you bring up their family, not their own health, when you bring up if they've had a health experience, a bad diagnosis, a bad trip to the doctor, a baby coming into the family or a grandchild coming into the family. There's a guy who's Barry Chick, and Barry runs a company called Naturepedic, and they make mattresses.
Okay.
He spent his whole career as an environmental engineer helping companies figure out how to get out of toxic chemical regulatory problems. That was his role. So he knew everything about toxic chemicals, but from the perspective of really helping companies avoid too much compliance cost or achieve compliance effectively and cost effectively and efficaciously. And so he had a grandchild, his first grandchild, and he went to buy a mattress for his first grandchild. And he looked at the tag and looked at the website, and he said, I'm not going to put my grandchild
Interesting.
in those chemicals, right? And so, as one does, he went out and started a mattress company.
Brilliant.
right in the central, right in his part of Ohio. And I've been to his plant now. We have certified his mattress. We've looked at all the components: the organic cotton, the organic bindings, the how he holds it together, every aspect of it. And this was just a wake up moment that was not about his health. It was about his grandchild. And
it's not too dissimilar to what you do,
trouble.
though, because I'm fascinated by entrepreneurs. I get to talk to them I love talking to them as much as I can, because for me, an entrepreneur, they try to solve a problem and they take responsibility for solving a problem that isn't inherently theirs to solve. And for the environmental working group, like, what was that initial catalyst to set it up?
So we started 31 years ago.
It's amazing.
And initially there were plenty of environmental groups out there already. But the thing I was vexed by was how difficult it was at that point in the environmental movement, where, we'd passed all kinds of laws already. We had in the US the Environmental Protection Agency. We'd had an Earth Summit of the UN, of the Community of Nations in Stockholm that I attended in 1972. It was well advanced, but I decided that what we needed in the environmental movement was a better job of communicating directly to people. At that point, you did it through the media mostly. Now, of course, we can more reliably do it directly through the website. But the problem I wanted to solve was the gap between what I knew as an expert about toxic chemicals or agriculture, which was my main area of expertise and experience, the gap between what was there and what the public understood. I was fascinated. And so we built our think tank with a different set of rules. The researchers weren't entirely in charge. They had to come forward to, and I had been had a background as a policy analyst. I'd have a master's degree in soil science. I came from sort of a technical background, but what I really wanted to do was have the technical experts test themselves against a simple metric, which is, will it be newsworthy enough to be picked up by credible sources, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal? So we want to have staying power. We don't want to be a flash in the pan, but can you write what you're thinking through? Can you explain the problem in a way that the public will understand and be engaged with? And if you can't do that, then go back to the drawing board. I'm not asking for you to change your results. I'm asking for you to look at all the results you have and think through, okay, what's the story here?
Yeah.
Because I wanted people to have stories in their mind, new stories in their mind about the environment, new stories about pesticides, new stories about toxic chemicals, new stories about how we spend our billions of dollars, as you do in Europe, on farm subsidies that oftentimes make environmental problems worse and aren't necessarily making the economics of farming better. So those were the problems that fascinated me. And over time, what has happened as environmentalism, I think, has changed is now, and it goes to your point about entrepreneurs, now I find myself really drawn to people who are solving environmental problems. And environmentalism was, and still is to a considerable degree, still at Environmental Working Group, we're fighting against bad stuff. We want, we want to stop coal-fired power plants. We want to stop chemical pollution. We want to say no to a lot of things. But increasingly, I'm spending time with entrepreneurs who are saying, you know what? I've got a solution. I can make a clean product. I can make personal care products cleaner and healthier. I can make food organically without pesticides. I can make a bike lube without Teflon.
It's a big problem.
All across the economy. It's so what we're fighting for now is as important as what in the past as environmentalists we fought against. This is the priority, and it's a completely different set of challenges to solve that I wasn't particularly trained for, right? I was trained to stop stuff or shift policies to incentivize through regulation, different activity. But someone comes along, personal care products, bike lube, there's no rules. Someone just decided, you know what? I don't want to make a bike lube. And I'm thinking of my friend, Peter Arlane, who makes this. It's called Mountain Flow Bike Lube. And he makes a ski waxes too. And he makes it without these Teflon chemicals. On a lot of bike lubes, you'll see the little Teflon badge, right? Well, that's this family of chemicals called PFAS, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances that are now the public poster child number one for toxic chemicals on the planet. And, they're very toxic. They persist forever in the environment. If they get in you, they last for years. And they're linked to all kinds of health problems. We're on the verge of some really big regulatory crackdowns here in the States, finally, after decades, on this family of chemicals. And Peter comes along and he thinks, everyone's in their shed, kind of like your dad, except or in their basement, and they're waxing skis. They're putting this Teflon stuff on their skis. And then I don't know what the exact process, but apparently you heat it up. So the fumes are coming off. And he's thinking, well, everyone's concerned about this family of chemicals, and the ski wax up until now has been full of these chemicals because it slides across the snow.
But you're so right on this, because something you said there, it's story. We're drawn to story since we were cavemen. We sat around a fire and we listened to stories, and maybe podcast is a modern expression of that. But the power of packaging that story correctly, because there's a difference between a good story and a bad story. I've known for years that I should be taking omega-3s. I've had nutritionists on the podcast, and every one of them say you should take omega-3s. Someone sent me a clip from Dr. Rhonda Patrick talking about omega-3s, and she talked about a recent study where they compared smokers and non-smokers, omega-3 users and non-omega-3 users. So if you were a smoker and you took omega-3, you had the same death risk as a non-smoker who didn't take omega-3. And for me, that was just like mind blown. That was it. Like, I literally ordered omega-3s online, a full year supply, within 25 seconds of listening to that conversation. And that's what a story can do. It can move us to action.
Absolutely. Advertising will bounce off. Facts will bounce off if they're not delivered in a fashion that draws you in. And to me, what we specialize at Environmental Working Group, it's not so much, getting people concerned about polar bears and wilderness and climate change as a function of the buildup of CO2 in the atmosphere and so forth. Our environmentalism is much more focused on the intimate and the personal. And so we try and tell the kind of story that you're telling that got you to finally focus on omega-3s. Those are the learning moments. I think they come easier to women. I'm convinced they come easier to women than to men when it comes to personal health. There are all these studies, and I'm terrible about going to the doctor. My wife has to bug me to go to the doctor, and men are generally terrible. That there are studies from the Cleveland Clinic that show that men would rather clean the toilet and take out the trash or go shopping with their wife than go to the doctor. That's, a little offensive there as someone who was raised by two women, but I'll tell you what, it's true. And so there's a sensibility there that I feel like we need to find our way to in politics and in behavior, environmental protection, and so forth. And it's it's something that's protective, and it's something that says, look, let's let's not wait for the perfect solution here. If we think we've got something that looks pretty good, I don't want to wait because I got kids and I'm worried about my kids. So let's just go to the safer thing. Let's not do whack-a-mole with the toxic chemical of the week. If we can buy organic and just avoid them altogether, then I can think about, it leaves me time to think about something else.
Okay, so let's make this a little bit actionable then, because I am often frustrated when I listen to podcasts and I'm like, okay, that was all really interesting, but I don't really have any actionable takeaways from it. So let's talk actionable takeaways. If we're using kind of I'm sure we could talk about toxins for the next 6 months and you wouldn't run out of toxins to talk about. But if we apply that kind of Pareto principle, like we can get the 80-20, like what's the 20% of stuff we should be focusing on to give us the 80%? Where are the biggest toxicity threats to us, be they airborne, ingested, or otherwise?
Start at home. Don't think of the environment as smokestacks in the distance or even going on a wilderness expedition. Think of the environment when you're walking through the grocery store, walking through the drugstore, or sitting in your home. Here's where to start. You'll get more than 80% of the exposure reductions by being smarter about what you eat. Organic is the best option still, because not only does it dramatically limit the number of pesticides in your diet that you'll be exposed to, but a lot of people don't realize that all over the world, organic standards also prohibit lots of artificial additives, colorings, and fillers, and so forth. Those are disallowed on the organic label all over Europe and certainly in the US. So start with what you eat. And then we have guides for people when you can't find or afford organic. My friend Phil Landrigan used to say that organic is private school for food. It's great if you can find it, great if you can afford it, but not everyone can. So at EWG, we have developed for different food categories ways you can avoid chemicals without having to find and afford organic. So start with your food. Secondly, your home environment. Air pollution is much worse in most places inside your home than it is when you step out the door. Even if
Can I jump in one second, Ken, before we move on to air pollution? Because even the label organic, I think, for me, I've been a little bit confused about the labeling of foods. It seems like you can make claims on food labels that aren't always based in facts. Like, I bought a Snickers bar after a cycle a couple of weeks ago, and it said protein Snickers on it. I'm like, okay, let me investigate this, and flip open the back of it, and there's like 1 gram of protein or 2 grams of protein in the Snickers bar. And I'm like, is that not regulated? And then that got me thinking about, well, when something says organic, is this the same marketing claim, or is this endorsed by a more of a central body that verifies this is actually organic?
Well, there is a standard, and that's established by governments, and there is an inspection system in every country that requires at each level of the food production process, from the farm straight through manufacturing, that you're supposed to follow certain rules, or you can't use the organic claim. Now, is there the room for cheating? Yes, but generally speaking, organic around the world has to meet all the standards for health of regular food, and any labeling standard with respect to nutrition disclosure, what the elements are in the food that have gone through the process of developing a label that says here's how much fat, here's how much sugar. Some countries have better labeling than others, but you have to follow all of those rules plus all of the rules of organic on top of it. Now, I'm not saying it's perfect, and I'm not saying you can't eat organic junk food. You certainly can find it, no question about it, because organic doesn't specify anything about nutrition. It's all about the production process and mostly about additives in processed food or pesticides or other substances in fresh produce. But as a starting point, we think that's a great way to go. But you introduce a really key point that it's hard for people to absorb. A tremendous amount of the consumer products that we encounter in day-to-day life, it's largely self-regulated by the industry.
Yeah.
And on top of that are these bogus market claims that tell you this is going to help your heart, or this is a protein Snickers bar. Those kinds of things that are directly misleading. Those claims, bad as they are on top often of a lack of regulation. Personal care products, food additives in the U.S. You can put pretty much anything. If you're a company and you self-approve an additive, you can put it in your food. And
Scary.
Our government agencies don't look at it. Same with personal care products. Same, you can put almost anything. There's no pre-market safety standard for ingredients or final products. So that's why we say, start in your home, start with food, then go. It's sort of a judgment call. We usually say, look at your personal care products. Your skin is your largest organ. Many of the chemicals that you put on your skin with skincare products, shampoo, soaps, makeup, go straight into your bloodstream. There's been very little regulation of that area. We have seen in recent years some shocking examples where you would think it'd be regulated, like these PFAS chemicals that should not be in us, and they're in skincare. They're in dental floss. they're everywhere. No wonder they're showing up when we test people's blood. 98+% of the American public already has these toxins in them. We don't need it. These are non-essential uses. Well, we have guides, and others do too. I'm sure they do in Europe. Public interest groups mostly, also some universities, they will help you find examples of consumer products, personal care, cleaning products, whatever's under your kitchen sink, whatever's in your closet to clean your home. These are major sources of exposures that you can dramatically eliminate, and you don't have to move to a mountain meadow and live in a yurt. You can live your life, and because we never needed them to begin with. It was money, lack of regulation. Regulation will probably never get around to controlling most of these sources of exposure. You should just do it yourself. And mostly, we're seeing that sectors of the economy that in the past weren't paying attention to this are now doing it, like personal care. Food, I think early on, people with organic were focused on, at least pesticides, if not food additives. And I think certainly cleaning products are getting cleaner.
Some of it's just a blind spot for us, though, I think, Ken, because as you're talking here, my mind is kind of running through this itinerary of stuff that I'm putting into my body and on my body. And I'm like, I have never once checked the ingredients in my toothpaste. And I've been brushing my teeth for 40 years now, and I've never checked the ingredients on my toothpaste. And I'm like, that's the first thing I'm going to do when I hang up this podcast. I'm like, what the hell am I putting into my mouth all this time?
Right. And one of the things, I happen to brush my teeth with toothpaste that has fluoride in it. But if you read the tube, it says don't swallow it because of the fluoride. And, we fluoridate water too. And I know it can be controversial, but the science to us is concerning that we have to be thoughtful about fluoride. PFAS has fluoride in it. That's one of the reasons we're concerned about it, and regulatory agencies around the world are cracking down on this family of chemicals now that went through the regulatory system for decades without being touched. I mean, I say, it's the whole regulatory system: clean air, clean water, product safety. Teflon slid through that the way pork chops slide off a Teflon frying pan. Didn't stick at all. And so now we have this problem where not only are these substances, these PFAS, so-called forever chemicals, in most of us in the developed world, they're in wildlife all over the world. We did my scientists on my staff reviewed the literature and found results from over 600 species from every corner of the world, from the middle of the Pacific, from Antarctica, emperor penguins. They all have this shit in their bodies now that we, in some cases, use just because it was a convenience, like Teflon pans. Sometimes we used it completely for no other reason than it was convenient. In makeup, it's used in floor wax. So you go to an airport and you see the guys out there, the men and women who are buffing the floor. In many cases, the wax they've applied has these PFAS chemicals in it. It wears off. It's in the dust as you're walking through the airport, your kid's school, a hospital, and it's there. And so just this, and some of these exposures, obviously, unless you stop flying in an airplane, we have to solve those as a society. And that's an important message to convey here. But many of them, we're just telling people, look, in the fullness of time, government might push through the industry opposition, push through the complex science and regulate this. But meanwhile, you can do without it. So I lube my bike now with Mountain Flow bike lube because it's just one more thing to eliminate me introducing these Teflon and Scotchgard and other types of chemicals into the environment that end up in all of us.
So you remember you'd watch those TV shows where somebody would go in and they'd be really badly dressed and the host of the TV show would be a style specialist and they'd make them over. So that's kind of the challenge I want to lay down to you here. So you talked about that transition from regular food, or what I'm terming regular food, my standard diet, to organic. What are the other areas in this makeover that if you're coming in to me or someone like me's life and you're saying, okay, here's the big ticket items we need to catch straight away. What else are you working on? Air quality in the house?
I would any source of air quality in the house, and one of the big sources that we worry about are asthmagens that come off of all kinds of products, cleaning products. They can come off of upholstery. So for cleaning products, we have a guide. Others have a guide. I don't know how well the products will line up with what's on the market where you live, Anthony, but we focused on that, and there are regulatory agencies here in California where I'm calling in from that are very focused on indoor air pollution because we have rules on smokestacks and rules on automobile exhaust and other major sources of air pollution outdoors, but indoors, not so much. And the asthmagen count indoors, the organic chemicals that waft off of your countertop, or when you clean the oven or clean your bathroom, or even in some cases, wash your dishes. We have gone through and rated them ingredient by ingredient to try and give people, at least in the U.S. context, better choices that don't have these chemicals. Upholstery that has often has flame retardants on it that we didn't need. Those are gradually being phased out in the U.S. They may also have these stain and water repellent chemicals in the PFAS family on the upholstery. Now, those are the big purchases, and you're not going to run out and buy a new sofa every day. But when you do, or when you buy a mattress, take care to see if there isn't an option that you can afford that might not have these kinds of characteristics. And one final area, again, is personal care products. We have what we call Skin Deep, our website, something like 100,000 products that are available in the U.S. market for every manner of personal care. It's your toothpaste, your makeup, shampoo, the whole thing, everything you'd find in the personal care aisle of a drugstore or a grocery store. And we rate them all, and we try and give you our best judgment. Sometimes there's not much information in the open literature. We try and convey that to people for ingredients and give you choices that, in our judgment, lower exposures to chemicals that we should be concerned about, phthalates, other types of things that are approved and allowed for use in these products. And we're fighting it out with the government. There are groups all over Europe fighting it out, all over the world fighting it out to try and make these products safer. But oftentimes their progress is very slow. And so you're right. The makeover, don't wait for fashion to change to reach you. Find someone who helps you, with your fashion choices sooner.
Say we have some of these bigger ticket items, mattress, couch in the house. and we don't have the financial resources to change those at the moment. Is there a way to mitigate the damage? Can we purify the air within our home to negate some of that toxicity?
Ventilation is the best thing to do. We're sort of caught between wanting to have energy efficiency, which the first step is to close up the house, right? Especially in climates that have a serious winter or a baking hot summer and you have the air conditioning on. But being able to ventilate the house is the most efficient, fastest thing to do that's cost effective for most people. Just make sure you have fresh air coming through if you can. And look, I have products in my home, couches that I want to replace because I know that they have chemicals in them. We've transitioned to organic mattresses, so where you spend most of your time when you're at home in bed, the single biggest place. We certainly recommend organic mattresses there, and the one we have gone deepest on is made by a company here in the U.S. called Naturepedic. But what's beginning to happen, Anthony, that is really, really encouraging to me is that because through the internet, people now have the capability to make these decisions on their own. They can find a source they trust, and there are a lot of good sources out there. We like to think we're one of them. That's starting to move the market.
Yeah.
Companies are noticing that people want safer products. And it turns out in some of very high-profile cases where we've seen internal company documents where they're under great stress to deal with something that's been discovered by the world as toxic that they make. You hear again and again or read in their internal documents the same story. And the story goes like this, that the scientists say, look, we've made this for a long time and we don't agree that it's dangerous. The lawyers will say, if it looks like there's liability, we ought to think about changing what we make and how we make it to reduce that liability, this toxic substance. The business people will say it's going to cost us X to make the change, so we better be careful or we're getting financial trouble. But the people who actually make the products in the companies, for lack of a better word, the engineers, they often say, why didn't you tell me you wanted safe? I'm an engineer.
Yeah.
I'll design to the spec. You said you wanted a lot of it. You wanted it to be cheap. You wanted it to have these other properties like Teflon. You wanted the eggs to roll off the frying pan. You didn't tell me you wanted safe.
We're optimizing for the wrong thing.
Yeah. And over time in the markets where it's personal care products, where it's a lot of churn, they're consumer non-durable products where you're using them every day. There's a heavy emphasis on marketing, heavy emphasis on helping people form habits so they buy your eggs and your shampoo and everything else every week. That's where we have noticed the changes happening and driving companies much more strongly, even retailers much more strongly in the direction of safer, healthier, sustainable stuff. It's not perfect. It's not a perfect driver. But if a customer is saying, I just don't want this Teflon stuff in my dental floss.
But you know what, Ken? It's
Can't we come up with something else?
It's not just the engineers who are optimizing for the wrong thing. It's us as consumers who are optimizing for the wrong thing.
Of course.
We're concerned with getting to the gym, riding our bikes. If we're really into it, we're geeking out on cold plunges or infrared saunas or red light exposure. But yet at the same time, we're lying for 8-9 hours a night on toxic chemicals. We're drinking tap water, which is contaminated. We're showering and using shower gel, which is contaminated. I think it's just a blind spot for a lot of us.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. And it's not insurmountable to deal with it. It's simply a matter of, just, giving it enough thought to make a few choices that link you up to healthier habits and you can just stick with, and then you're done. You're doing it without thinking, the definition of a habit, right? And you're right. I notice myself when I'm in a period of really focusing on something that requires me to perform athletically. And in my case, it's not really competition. It might be 100-mile ride, or it might be, I'm gonna make my way up to Mount Tam, and I'm gonna keep track on my Strava and make my time X amount better. I find that when I'm doing that, sometimes I'm forgetting some of the basics like hydration and the other functional aspects of health that allow me to get on the bike, put my leg over it to begin with, right? And I think you're onto something there. These are really blind spots, and there's no cost to eliminating them in most cases. It's just sometimes just a moment, like you with your vitamin, right? It's just boom. Okay, that's that problem solved. I'm going to move on to the next. Now I can worry about NATO or something, right? I don't have to worry about the shit that's in my shampoo. I'm done. So, I'm going to move on. And women do that. That's what women do that we don't do as guys often. They're just like, well, okay, let's just avoid this thing. Let's not wait for the science to come in, or I don't have to read the medical journals. Here's a choice over here that doesn't have that stuff, and then I can worry about getting the kid to school on time.
But so you mentioned water. So I've been trying to make better choices around water, but as this conversation's unfolding, I realize I'm still making quite bad choices. So our tap water, I know it has quite high levels of fluoride in it. So for right or wrong, I said, you know what, maybe I'm better off drinking bottled water. But now, as this conversation is unfolding, I'm like, well, actually, that doesn't sound like a smarter decision at all, because it's probably contaminated with the plastics that it's stored in. What should I be doing around water?
We tell people, so we built a database just for the U.S. Again, the water utilities here, the suppliers are required by our federal EPA to test water for all kinds of contaminants. We spent years collecting that data from the water utilities and building a database called the Tap Water Database. Except it's not a government database, it's us. And we went through it, and here's what we concluded. There are lots of chemicals in tap water for which there aren't protective regulatory standards, so they're legal. And one of our big themes at EWG is just because something's legal doesn't mean it's safe.
Yeah.
Something's been adjudicated, the lobbyists have come in, the bureaucrats have been forced to compromise, the scientists have been ignored, all kinds of things happening. And the outcome in water is you have contaminants that aren't at safe levels. Fluoridation, we happen to think fluoridation is not the best way to prevent dental problems. It's better to brush a little fluoride on and spit it out than to constantly drink and inhale. So here's what we tell people. Go to our database, find out what's in your water. Then we have recommendations for filtration so that you can, at home anyway, or when you're getting water ready for a bike ride, you can filter your water before you go. Filtered tap water, we think, is the smarter way to go financially, economically, and also with respect to exposures. Now, bottled water is almost always filtered heavily, but we do worry about the plastics. We're just discovering this crazy situation with micro and nanoplastics everywhere in our heart tissue, in umbilical cord blood, in placenta. These microplastics are everywhere, and no one was even talking about it 5-10 years ago. So there's reason to try and take on the plastic economy yourself because of the immediate possibility of exposure. You'd have to test your water to know if there are microplastics in it, but we know from a number of studies that microplastics are in food, they're in water, they're in air, they're traveling in the air. So we've made a mess of this planet, Anthony. I mean, a mess. And the cleanup when it comes to water for us is probably better to filter your own at home, find out what's in it first so you get the right filter. And then, if you're out and about, if you have a bottle with you, stainless steel is what we recommend. Fill it with water at a station that's maybe offers filtration. But you certainly want to drink bottled water as opposed to a sugary drink most times. So it's easy to find your way through the decision tree, but if you start with where you drink, and cook with water at home and filter those sources. You could even argue a whole house filtration makes sense because some of the stuff that comes out of the shower when you're in it is worrisome.
Well, I was going to ask, would you extend that filtration to personal hygiene, washing?
Yeah, it depends on what's in your water. If you have high levels of certain chemicals, like the chemicals they treat water with, at least in the US, often end up creating pollutants, contaminants in the finished water that you can be exposed to by inhaling it in the shower. And I'm a person of shower, not baths. And so it's, something to think about. We don't have whole house filtration here where I live now. We've had it in the past. Where I live now, we don't have these trihalomethanes. Our water treatment process tends to be a little more benign. But when I was living back east outside of Washington, we knew from our studies that they were at high levels. So we filtered the whole house. It's harder to do that if it's expensive for one thing. It's also harder to do it if you're in a place where water's in short supply because whole house filtration often wastes quite a bit of water, even as you're filtering it, right? So there's all these choices. We've kind of backed ourselves in. We have polluted water in our taps. And once you do that and you're trying to back your way out of those problems, it's like neglecting your training until you get to the start line. It's not to introduce bike metaphors every step of the way here as we discussed, but as long as we're at it, it's like just stepping up to think, well, in my case, I can ride 80 miles without a problem. Well, you can't. And you've already waited too long. You've already let problems accumulate that are only going to get worse and more expensive to solve if you go out on that bike ride. You'll end up with injuries or in the hospital or maybe worse. So I just think that for water, and we've tried to get decision trees in front of people for every room of their house and not wagging our finger at them and saying you're going to drop over dead. These are chronic exposures. They lead to chronic diseases mostly that take a while to manifest. Cancer, of course, is notoriously long latency period for most cancers. So we're constantly telling people, look, don't throw out your food. Eat the food you've got. And then as you're moving forward, shop a little smarter. Don't throw out everything in your makeup case or in your bathroom cabinet or under your sink. You can use that, but just be thinking longer term and get rid of the things that are notably producing aspergens when you open the cap and scrub your sink top. Apply things to your skin that rate well in our rating system, and there are rating systems that are available around the world that do the same, trying to do the same sort of thing. Just push the whole sector in the direction of safer chemicals. And it is happening. It's definitely happening. Driven by consumers, not by regulators.
We opened this conversation, and one of the quotes you had was, "The poison's in the dose." How concerned should we be with our current lifestyles? How much of a threat is it to, without sounding alarmist, to us as a species?
Yeah. Well, we've moved as a species in most parts of the world from lifespans shortened by diseases that obviously are infectious, bad water, bad sewage, what have you. We've moved away from that to chronic diseases, and the environment is a key part of what is triggering a lot of these chronic diseases. Neurodevelopmental issues, problems with neurological decline, cancer, problems related to inability to get pregnant or carry babies to term. All of these chronic conditions, birth defects, they all have environmental factors underlying them. So we should be concerned about reducing exposures. It's not even remotely crazy to try and do that. And as we've discussed, you can reduce tens of thousands of exposures without dramatic changes in your life or dramatic expense, just by being smarter in your shopping and your behavior. So that's very doable, but we should be concerned. And some of these issues that have emerged fairly recently tell us that we've had a coarse and rather uninformed view of what we should be wary of when it comes to environmental chemicals. And the example I always give is these so-called endocrine disrupting chemicals. You've heard of them, right? These are chemicals that are endogenous to our bodies, but when they come into our body, and they could come in from a contamination source, air pollution, something in your water, something in your food, personal care products, these are chemicals that mimic hormones. And they affect our endocrine system, our hormone-producing organs in our bodies, of which there are many, by masquerading in certain ways that cause our bodies to behave as if they've been exposed to that hormone. And sometimes the reactions are adverse. And the people who, it turns out, are most concerned about these endocrine disrupting chemicals are not really environmentalists per se, it's endocrinologists. And these are scientists and practitioners who are dealing, as you always are with hormones, with parts per trillion of exposure that can affect how your body behaves. So my message to people is we are really still on the frontier of understanding how these chemicals might be contributing to the burden of disease, whether that disease is cancer, difficulty with getting pregnant or carrying a baby to term, a neurological problem early in life like ADHD, or a neurological problem that might be experienced later like Parkinson's. Look up any of these diseases, these health conditions, and you will add the word environment, and you will begin to see the literature that's emerging. Some are more advanced than others, but in most cases, there is an environmental dimension that's now being explored, and sometimes it wasn't even on the radar 10 years ago. So that tells me, be thoughtful about what you're exposing yourself to and your family to, your loved ones, your community. It sends the message back through the economy much more rapidly than a political campaign often can. Not that we should step away from civic responsibility, but you can make these changes, and you should make these changes to eliminate these exposures because they come with a risk.
Ken, absolutely fascinating and eye-opening conversation. Thank you very much for giving so freely your time. I'm going to link up your website and all the various resources we talked about in today's show notes for people to go and check out. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Anthony.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please click up here. There's another video I know that you're absolutely going to love. And we're just getting started, so subscriptions really matter. Click over here and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our amazing upcoming guests.